Lords of the Fallen's just launched, and let's go over some performance, because I know that's going to be a big thing that a lot of people are going to deal with if they're playing this on PC, not console. So I'm going to go through some of the settings that I've got. If this is your first time on my channel, the way I do things here is by upfronting the knowledge of my videos, so you can stick around to see if it's the right one for you. So with that being said, I'm just going to tell you one of the biggest things that helped me out. I have a pretty beastly machine. You can see in the description below. The biggest thing that helped me was my FPS limiter. So I'm going to use the performance window in the upper left corner over here. Unfortunately, it's the biggest one I could find to display FPS and reliable other stats. But you can notice my GPU utilization is at 90%, 98%. When I was at 144, this was capped out at 100, and it was just, everything was running sluggish. To be fair, I will say I am using OBS to record right now, so that is going to skew all of these results. Expect that you probably will receive FPS or GPU utilization a little bit lower. FPS higher and GPU utilization a little bit lower. But I noticed that being at 144 frames a second, as far as my cap went, was actually causing a much higher GPU utilization. Now, again, that could be because I was using OBS at the time. So I would say, before you even get into the video, bring your FPS limit down to 90. That should be one that really help you out. And make sure if you're on an NVIDIA chip, you've upgraded your drivers. I know that seems like a no-brainer, but this whole DLSS, this specific game is using DLSS 3. And if you haven't updated your drivers in a long time, it's trying to tap into a version and you might be out of date on, or whatever the hell the situation is. Just make sure that you have DLSS, your NVIDIA card updated. I would say those two things alone, you'll notice an increase in your performance. Now, I'm going to go through all of the graphics options and everything, but I just wanted to give you some upfront knowledge so that you can just kind of jump back into the game, see if those things work, and then start toggling things from there on and have some fun after that. And another thing too is both reflection quality and global illumination. Both of these are going to tap into ray tracing. So having them below high will stop using ray tracing. As you can see over there, settings of high and above use more accurate ray tracing methods to solve reflections. That's not to say that it'll shut off ray tracing, but putting it at least to medium will make it so that it's using less ray tracing. And if your card does not have ray tracing, I would just outright put this to low so that you try to get as little as possible. So these two settings, putting them to medium if you don't have a particularly good, strong ray tracing card, can also really quickly help you out in FPS. But if that's all you wanted to know, please feel free to just shut the video down. Hopefully that helps you out in getting back to Lords of the Fallen at a palatable frames per second. You can jump ahead to any part of this video that interests you the most, as I'll be going through some of the different graphics presets so you can get an idea for the FPS as well as what the visual fidelity looks like when you're playing Lords of the Fallen. Also, don't forget to check me out on Twitch, where I will be streaming this game as well as a lot of other YouTube videos coming out for this. But let's get started here on our performance guide for Lords of the Fallen. All right, so to start us off, let's talk about display. And when you are playing in a full screen, it's always going to be better for you as far as the system resources go. If I click this over to, let's just go to like windowed full screen and confirm, we're at 72 frames per second and 98% utilization. Unfortunately, that's not really reliable because of OBS, but this can sometimes, it won't be. Yeah, there we go. Our frames are kind of a little bit more choppy now. Maybe if we move around, it'll be a little bit different. And this isn't always the case. I've just noticed that if you're really struggling for system resources and you're having a struggle with FPS, make sure the game is running in full screen. I personally love windowed full screen, so that's my take there. But that's a quick one you can do to kind of get a little bit of boost there in, oh man, no way, we're not playing in 1440. Wait for that to kick over. There we go. Outside of that though, if you have a G-Sync monitor, turn off V-Sync. For your FPS limit, you typically want to use whatever matches your hertz of your monitor. I'm at 144. It seems to be okay ever since I did an update to my drivers and tweaked some other things, but it's not going to hurt you just to go to a 90 frames per second cap. Wait for a couple patches to come out with performance. It's also worth noting I'm playing on a version of the game that is a day early in access. So there might have been a patch by the time you play where some of this FPS talk is just not worth it. So I just want to be upfront and transparent about that. As far as your DLSS goes, this is just going to be very standard and customary stuff. It depends on if you have an AMD or an NVIDIA card. Nowadays, I pretty much always recommend DLSS unless you have a very solid machine that you just never deal with FPS drop below 60. It's just really not going to affect you that much. You can increase the sharpness if it really bothers you. Just don't go overboard, because if you go 100% sharpness, and I'm actually gonna, I was gonna do this in the graphics section, but I'll do that later, because the film grain just looks like shit no matter what. Okay, so if you go too sharp, sometimes it can kind of really make details. Like look on the cloak there, right? Look how that's kind of like a little blurred, and that'll kind of come in and out because that's part of how DLSS works. There you go. Up there's the textures that kind of pop around. It's just trying to get at that target frames, trying to keep you somewhat fluid. So if you don't know how DLSS works, it will constantly configure the resolution of the game and textures to put it in the easiest, most distilled terms possible, to make it so that the game doesn't suffer any FPS drop. Just be wary that if you drop it all the way down to 0, you can take a look. Confirm, is that in? It can make things a little bit blurrier. Sharpness is just going to add a little bit more of a crispness to those edges. Like if you take a look at the tacets at the bottom of near my boot, you'll see that they'll kind of blur out a little bit here and there as I move around. Sharpness kind of tends to keep things from blurring too much, in case you did not know. And keep mine about 55. Reflex, this is better if it's a first-person shooter. So if you're suffering from a lot of frames per second issues, you can just shut it off. Get yourself a little bit more headroom, whatever the hell. And don't use FSR if you are using DLSS, and vice versa, right? I mean, you can use FSR even if you have an NVIDIA chip, because AMD is awesome. They're just like, hey, take it all. But NVIDIA DLSS will only work on NVIDIA chips. You can use FSR. You can try it out. It sometimes will actually give you better performance. It's going to be on a per card basis though. So if you have a 1080 or a 2080 or something in those series of cards, dabble with AMD FSR, because sometimes it actually gets a little bit better. I've noticed that the infrastructure of 30s and 40s works a little bit better with DLSS. But that's your display. Let's move now into graphics and talk about those settings before we show off some graphic settings. Now for the graphics tab. Now, just to quickly recap this again, we talked about that in the intro, but reflection quality and global illumination are pretty important in this entire list because they use ray tracing. Settings of high and above use more accurate ray tracing methods to solve lighting, but can reduce performance. So if you're having a lot of issues, set these to low, if not medium. Just depends on your card. If you 1080, don't even set it to low. I don't know what it's going to be like on a 1080, which doesn't have a RTX. It's a GTX, right? So I wouldn't even dabble with them. I'd keep that low and put the other things high if you really want a better visual fidelity. Also, another thing that's probably going to really help you out is shutting off all of these ones that are on or off. They are post-processing, which typically means that this happens after the graphics have rendered, and it's very light on your graphics card overall GPU hit. But they're also a pain in the ass. Who the hell keeps motion blur and film grain on? Not in today's age, no sir. Chromatic aberration, it just kind of makes visual things look funky. And you can then also turn this down as well, post-processing quality. Unfortunately, this will include a depth of field, which I also hate, but I love bloom. So setting this to ultra is really not going to have that much of an effect on your card because it's post-processing. The graphics have already rendered. You're just trying to get as much as you, if you are trying to get as much as you can, then go ahead and just turn this to like low. I mean, like I said, this says post-processing effects include motion blur, depth of field, and bloom. If you've turned 2 of those off in the settings below, this really only affects bloom. I'm sorry, depth of field we can't shut off, but this affects pretty much bloom and depth of field. So you can set that to ultra if you want really good bloom, but just to kind of show you, you can see that it doesn't really change the depth of field too much, right? Like it's not like it's crazy blurred in the background, which can actually lead to huge performance hits. So the depth of field in this game is what I'm trying to say is not too bad. But outside of that, we have some other things that we can tweak. Generally, you should just put your shadows to medium if you're suffering from a really big FPS hit. This is always going to help you out. So right now we're at high. Let's find a really shadowy spot over here, right? Before we even touch that. So our frames right now are just kind of stable at 72. Kind of looking around. Yeah. It's in the mid 70s. Little drop there into below 70s there. Like a fucking weatherman. Coming back here into graphics, we're going to set our shadows just to low now. And you can see our FPS is now high 80s. And there's really not that much of a difference, right? The difference in shadow quality, it's there for sure, but it's not enough for you to like really feel the hit is what I'm trying to say. And just to kind of show, here's a shot where we can see the shadows in the background. I'm gonna mess up my mouse. You know, I play this game with a controller, so it's weird not using a controller. So now you can see this is at ultra, and our frames went from 88 or so now down to 70, low 70s. So, and the graphic, the visual fidelity of the shadows is not that much better. So shadows are really one that you should always, in every single game you're playing, just turn it down. There's no reason for you to suffer through a heavy FPS hit for no reason. So you can even kind of see on the right over here, right on this little portion, the shadows on that rail, they kind of change. Okay, there's not much shadow, but as we come up, you can see a little bit more right there and a little bit more underneath the rail. And then like ultra makes it even more, and it just creates depth to the shadows. So we'll put that on medium. View distance, this determines the distance at which objects are culled for performance, meaning they kind of shift into a 2D sprite is the easiest way to describe it, but it just takes the dynamic and depth out of an image from far. So let me see if we can find something that can really kind of exemplify that. So you've got that pyre over there. That pyre's looking kind of just like a huge hunk of shit, like you do. And that's on high. And you can kind of see the tops of this kind of gothic cathedral looking stuff right in front of us. So let's go ahead and set this now down to low. Where is it? Aha. So that's low. And again, not too much of a difference, right? Remember, this game has to run on consoles. So the graphical fidelity doesn't seem to be too big from a lot of the presets from what I've taken a look at. Jumping back in this, I'm going to set this now to ultra. So a little bit sharper, a little bit better lighting on, say, like that big pyre, that big lava mound, and the lighting that kind of hits the structures over there. But by and large, it's not changing a whole ton when it comes to the way that this looks. So that is your view distance. I would just kind of set that to whatever you're comfortable with. I'm just going to keep mine at high. Anti-aliasing, this is going to be kind of dependent upon your machine. Keeping this on high shouldn't have too much of an issue, but if you're noticing you're suffering from FPS, it's definitely one that you can turn down with not much of an effect. So I'm going to put this to low. And you can see when you look at objects, their edges are kind of very stark. They don't blend in like they naturally would when you're looking at something. They look a little rough, kind of like they're cut out and put right in front of you, right? Like this thing has like very hard edges. Anti-aliasing is really going to help smooth that out. So we're going to come back in this, jump into ultra. So it's still hard, but those edges are a little bit cleaner. They're not a little bit blurred. Anti-aliasing kind of takes the pixelization out of a lot of those edges too, to just make it a little bit more smooth. But right now my FPS is at 80 and it's on ultra. So like I said, you're not going to notice too heavy of a hit. We're going to kind of move around here. We're jumping into the mid 60s, low 70s. Now let's jump back into that and put this at low. Kind of moving around. Kind of holding true now at 70s, low 70s, mid 70s. About I'd say like a 5 or 6 FPS boost, more or less. So not a massive one, but if you're looking for every little bit, it's one that you can definitely get a little bit out of. Put that back to high for myself. Now texture quality is going to be the one that's going to have the most visual effect. Also, it's probably going to affect your GPU the best. So right now this is at low. And you can see stationary, we're around 90 frames per second, and our GPU utilization is around that 75, 80%. And as we kind of move around, this should drop. And, I mean, you can see on the banners aren't very detailed anymore. They're just kind of scrolls there. My character, I mean, doesn't look terrible, right? He's a little bit flatter, not as dynamic. You can see even the sun hitting him, so got some good reflection going on, but that's because of the other settings, right? But you can see right there is a really good example of that texture pop from low texture quality. There you go. You can see that kind of like really kicking in there. But by and large, our frames are pretty solid, pretty stable. There is definitely a difference though, right? Stuff looks a lot flatter. Not terrible, but definitely flatter. And we're in the 80 plus. So let's go ahead and go back to settings. And now let's turn this up to ultra. And you can see all the detail on that tapestry immediately kick in right when we come on out. And the frame still, surprisingly, not as bad. It's dropping into like the mid 70s now, and we're going to find some pockets around here, probably with a lot of shadows and reflection that's going to drop a little bit. But you can see that this is going to give you about, though, roughly a 10 FPS boost, depending on where you're at, what kind of graphics card you have, stuff like that. Like if I go over to something that's got a lot more texture popping, and you can see that it kind of caused a little bit of FPS drop over there, but stuff like this, where it causes more reflection, there's more lights to deal with, that sometimes can cause FPS issues. But overall, you saw that the texture quality was not huge, but definitely evident from low to high texture quality. Visual effect quality is basically going to deal with how the lights interact with everything in the game, and anytime you cast a spell, stuff like that. And this will also, very similar to texture, have a pretty pronounced effect because you're basically dealing with how flat objects look as a result of, well, visual effects. So you can see this is on low, and like that building behind us looks just kind of lit up. This over here has some glowing coming off of it. My character just looks fine, right? Our FPS is pretty solid now. It's in that 80s, bouncing around over there. Man, I didn't realize that this is a creature until this exact moment. So that is our low setting. It's just about in that 80s, just teetering in the 90s. Let's set this into ultra. And the game itself had to it took a second right there. Like, ooh, chop, chop. So we'll take that, jump out, and look at that. Look at that photograph. So everything back there now has a lot more of a dynamic image, right? That building, those shadows, everything, that visual light that's pushing through it has a lot better of an overall look. You can see that the glowing on everything over here, it's just a little bit more nuanced now. You can see a little bit more going on over here with this lava. And our frames per second, still holding pretty strong. But it definitely drops below 80 more often than it did before. If we come over here into this region once more, this has got a lot of like fog and everything too, right? So those things will get hit by some of those visual effects as well. Now we're dropping now into like the kind of 70s region. In fact, actually, let me show you this. I think that this was the setting that does it. Yeah. So you see when I drop it to low, this becomes way less of like an apparent cool misty fog. And it's just kind of, yeah, oh, here's a little sputter of mist. And I bring this back up to high. You can kind of look around too. There's less overall mist in this region. Bring this back up to high. Or ultra. Oh, those frames are going to drop. I'm going to process a little bit. And that mist is a little bit more pronounced again, right? So that's how visual effect quality looks. Just kind of strike a level that's going to feel like you're not getting too much of a drop in good visual fidelity. I'll probably keep mine at like, I think high was not bad for me. Yeah, I mean, the frames drop. Now we're at like upper 70s, lower 80s. That's fine for me. And again, I assume that when I stop recording, that number is going to increase by 10, because that's usually what happens to me whenever I deal with this kind of stuff. Let's take a look at our next one. The next one I want to talk about is our reflection quality. Remember, this is the one that's going to use more ray tracing when we have it set higher. So this is it at low, and you can see, not too bad, not too terrible, right? Most things in this game at low are pretty great still, and we'll show some comparison shots towards the end of this video. But you can see here we're pretty solid at like a 90 frames per second. There's going to be points in the game when you deal with reflective surfaces where that can actually tank you pretty hard. Maybe you walk into like a chapel where it's a bunch of tile and stuff like that. That's where you're really going to notice an effect. But by and large, you probably won't notice it a whole ton. So let's take a look over here what it looks like at ultra. Remember, we were just like swimming around like 90, 80 frames. So now we're using a little bit more ray tracing, and utilization has gone up to near 100% on my GPU. Kind of walking around here just to kind of show a little bit of the reflective surfaces. A little bit smoother, right? You can see kind of like more dimension as we move around, rather than it just kind of being like, oh yeah, the side of your armor is lit up. Like, There's a lot more depth to that reflective surface rather than it just kind of being like, oh, there's glare coming off of metal. You know what I mean? And again, you're not going to notice too heavy of an FPS hit until you hit a series of reflective surfaces, and you'll notice it tank if you're not prepared for that level of like ray tracing and everything of the sort. Just to kind of, again, just find some surfaces here, get a little bit more of a halo as your backdrop from some light, but a much smoother, more visually appealing, what's it called? Reflective surface. So I would probably, since I have a 3080, I'm probably going to keep this at high. But if you have a 20 series and it's not like a 2090 or a 2080, I would probably, and even if you don't even have if you have like a 3070, I'd probably just keep it at medium. I'd probably just hang out at medium. If you really think you can spare some FPS, bump it to high, see how you do. If you really are having a problem with that, drop it down, because it's going to require so much ray tracing. Global illumination quality now controls the quality of dynamically calculated indirect lighting bounces, sky shadowing, and ambient occlusion. So ambient occlusion usually means something like, okay, light goes through a board and causes shadow on the other end. The smoothness of that shadow is typically ambient occlusion. That's also shadows, but it's like, that's probably one of the best descriptions I can have. It's like the soft edges that occur as a result of indirect lighting. This is one that I think you could just turn to low and not notice as much. So here it's a game on low. It's basically going to be richness and depthness of field when you kind of look at stuff that, okay, maybe I don't think my helmet's causing any reflections. If you were to walk through like a cavern with a bunch of like God rays coming through, you know, like those like beams of light, that's going to affect this setting. I don't think you're going to see much of a hit until you hit those points in the game, much like reflective quality. So our FPS right now, you can see it's at 90. We just kind of hang out, run around. And let's go ahead and now turn this to high. And by high, I mean ultra. So again, just more depth to a lot of the shadows. Things look a little bit richer. You can kind of look at this gate, and that might have an effect if we change that back and forth. If you look over here, so like this is a pretty good spot right there. So this is it on ultra. When we switch this to low, everything in this little section will become very flat. All those rods, all of the lighting, all the shadows that are on the left side of that like banister there, or that like portion, oh, that's part of that rod, right? Yeah, like that. Yeah. Watch what I'm saying. Low. So now it's flat, right? It just like, oh yeah, there's coloring on the left side of it, but by and large, all that just looks like it's just stone. There's no dimension to it. There's no shadows that come off of it as a result of the light coming from this direction. Not to be confused with shadows, which is direct light shadow. Let's go ahead and switch this back to ultra just to show you what I mean. Now you see that looks a lot more rich, or a lot richer. Like you can see the little individual lines in the stones. You can see the depth and the shadow on them. If you look at this little metal rod, there's more shadow on the left side than there was before. And these rods in general have more shadow cast into them. So that's what this setting does, in case you were kind of confused. But this is one, just like reflection, is probably fine at medium or high, and you probably won't even notice it. It's one of those ones that if you saw it side by side, you go, oh, I guess. Now our last toggleable is foliage quality. So this is what you would imagine, the foliage you see around you. It's usually also the density of said foliage. Is it a 2D sprite? Is it multiple 2D sprites? What kind of foliage are we dealing with here? Is it a Gadelia? Who knows? Who's going to place those? Who's going to plant those? So let's set this down. Oops. To low. You know what? Yeah, off. Outright off. This is off. And we just saw medium or high a second ago. There's no foliage whatsoever. That one's probably going to be a pretty big, huge hit to your FPS, because as you look around, it's just not having to render or deal with those, period. Kind of hanging out at 90. No big deal. Now let's bring that to ultra. Now we're still kind of just hanging out at 90, which isn't too bad. But any kind of outside environs, that's going to really kick your crap in. As you're meandering through portions of the town where there's far more foliage, that's really going to have an effect on stuff. This will also kind of affect certain things as you look into like the shadow realm too, especially like a lot of the shadow, a lot of like the reflective qualities too will kind of come out in this. But right now you can notice that we're dealing with like about a 5 FPS hit from various portions of this run because of now just denser foliage. To close us out, we're going to show off some graphic comparisons. I'm going to set each individual preset, so low, medium, high, and ultra, and I'm just going to go ahead and let them run. You'll be able to see what they look like, and then I will overlay. I'll split the screen in half so you'll be able to see maybe the low on the left side and the high on the right side, or maybe the high and ultra, so you can compare and contrast and decide. It's going to be the same scene, just superimposed over one another, so that you have a good idea of what you're getting. But I'm just going to let the video go ahead and go and end on that note. If you have any questions, you need any help with this, there is a stability patch that just launched, so it's actually going to help out a lot with those performance issues you might be having. Just remember, make sure your graphic drivers are updated and just kind of tweak things out. Make sure you also press apply. If you don't, a lot of these textures will not change. You have to make sure you press apply, or else it'll only apply a certain portion of your graphical settings. But as always, guys, thank you so much for watching here today. Have a good one and take care.